the image that we have of ourselves is, in the main, the farthest thing from what we really are. We create our self-image over much time, through much of our childhood, even into adulthood. And depending on the circumstance and how we are best able to deal with that situation to maintain a singular position, a position that is justified or in authority or forgiving or attaining, whatever, we gradually adopt roles, and we play out those roles under just incredibly varied circumstances, so that the image we have of ourselves, while it may in words, when we are confronted with the question, what is your self-image, we often are able to put down or list a number of qualities and attributes that we think are part of what we really are. They are the image that we like to present to ourselves, in effect, that we're honest, straightforward, hardworking, sincere, etc., etc., etc. When indeed, from moment to moment, depending on the event and depending on the interaction with the outside world or other people, we may manifest precisely the opposite characteristics of another image. So the question comes back to how I began, that our self-image is a figment and bears no real relationship in ordinary life to what we really are. What are we? Well, we are a product of an incredible variety of processes that have gone on essentially through our three brains, through our intellectual part, our feeling part, our sensory motor part, and each of those has a pattern of responses, reactions to elements in the outside world. In the moment, say in a moment when we are in the emotional part predominantly, that's who we are. And that's what we project. I am angry, I am irritated, I am joyful, I am whatever. In another moment, in our intellectual or physical motor part, we are somebody else totally, that may and often does bear no relationship to what the previous self-image was. So we very handily collect those over time to such a degree that by the time we reach young adulthood, we may have a role or a series of roles for son, for father, for brother, for employee or employer or profession or whatever. So we have quite a polyglot, a collection of roles, and we often play those with singular black and whiteness. Our role as a father can be one full of fun and enjoyment and consideration for children and so forth. And our role as an employer, we are like Scrooge, and we don't see the difference. We still have this figmentary, this fantasy image of ourselves as something other than all of those. So what characterizes each of us is as this polyglot of roles that are evoked. The other aspect of this that I think is so interesting and so important to emphasize is that it is not that we choose these roles. There is nothing conscious, nothing rarely intentional, even in a subconscious kind of way. They are evoked. So we are like puppets on a stage, and the role is drawn out from within us, and we play the role. And then we have this fantasy image of who we really are, which in most instances has nothing to do with the role. Initially, we have to make clear what we mean by an image, because we have, just in common usage, most of us, when the word image is made use of, we think of a visual image. And what I found useful, because it involves the same neural processes, and subjectively we experience them in the same way, and that is to call an entire arena of the productions of the central nervous system images, so that we have sensory images, and those would be images coming through vision, touch, hearing, taste, touch, smell. And then we also have this very, very elaborate aspect of the nervous system about which not enough has been said, that has invested every organ system in our body, from muscles all the way through individual organ functions and so forth. And all of this also feeds back through the nervous system into various aspects of our brain. And images are built, but now we refer to them, for instance, as inner sensations of hunger or fatigue or satiety. What we put into words as an image of that state, see, is really a result of all of the processes that are going on in those individual organ parts or systems, and the way in which the nervous system brings together the results of all of those processes that are going on. For instance, if you had a muscle cramp, and you feel the discomfort and relative pain and restriction that comes from the muscle spasm, we experience the cramp. Now that is an image, because it is a resonant representation in the nervous system of the state of something out there in the periphery. In this case, a piece of skeletal muscle. So we can have images that are purely in the sensory arena, all of our senses, both outside and inside. Then we get into this interesting arena of feelings or emotions, of joy, of depression, et cetera, et cetera. Those can also be looked upon as images, because they are equally, to our approach to the other levels of image, they are equally products. They are the end results of an enormously complex neurological and biochemical process that produces subjective experiences. Those experiences we put names on. That's the image. We say this is joyful, this is unhappy, this is irritating, this is whatever. But they are equally resonant representations. They are, compared to the state, they are resonant. And since they are not the state, they are a representation. So I think the term resonant representation is a useful one. You could use it interchangeably with image. And all images are resonant representations. When we come to the neocortical processes, the high brain, or what in the terminology we like to make use of, the third brain, because evolutionary-wise it has matured in order of the first primitive or musculoskeletal or sensory motor brain, and then the limbic or emotional brain, and finally the neocortical brain. Important to mention that we have one brain. No, we don't have three brains in the separated off sense at all, because from the very, very earliest appearance of a brain, the other two aspects, those that deal with the inner world and with the abstract world, are present. They are simply very, very, in a reptile, they are very diminished. They are barely representative, although they're there. If they were not there, the reptile would do nothing from itself. So all self-initiation requires this higher level of this one brain. So we can say that predominantly we have a great variety of life forms that are essentially one-brained. But that's not really true. They have the same brain that we do, in the sense that there are three aspects to it. The thinking or intellectual aspect, the feeling aspect, which has to do with the inner world, and then the sensory motor, which has to do with the interface with the outside world. So I think it's always important, because there can be much misunderstanding around first brain, second brain, third brain, if people think that we're trying to maintain that somehow or other we grew a second brain on top of the first brain. Well, it grew, but it grew integrated in every single evolutionary step. It grew in a very tightly integrated fashion with the first brain. So you can't ever get a separated circumstance here. Going to third brain images, these are even more interesting, because with us, with three brain beings, or with human beings, we come to the elaboration of a capacity which is truly astonishing. Man's ability to abstract, and I put abstraction as the kind of fundamental entry into true neocortical images. For instance, these lead to the use of sounds that stand for motions in the outside world, things, objects in the outside world. Ultimately, although it happens in a backwards fashion, since we begin to use language or sound sequences that stand for before we invent vocabulary, before we invent an alphabet even. There is no evidence that an alphabet had to be formed first, and then you put it together into words, and then you put it together into sentences, and then you put it together into paragraphs or syntactical operations and so forth. All of that, each of those does, however, represent a separate level of abstraction. You cannot have words in the written or spoken sense unless you have vowels and consonants. You must have an alphabet of soundings that stand for. Well, the standing for is the resonant representation. That's why we can say the images of the first brain, the second brain, and the third brain are all resonant representations. In this case, in the case of the neocortex, the images are all abstract. They don't refer to a motion or a thing. They don't refer to an emotional state. It is abstract. It is neither, and yet it can deal variably with both of those other worlds. In some instances, like in modern science, it deals very powerfully with the motions and forms of the outside world, because then we can go from language into mathematics, for instance, and we see that counting and then the elaborations by levels of abstraction, we can get into, we go from arithmetic to algebra, to geometry, to calculus. All of those are levels of abstraction that each of which has its own arena of resonant representations. In the case of mathematical developments, like in language, each successive development is completely dependent on what came before. You can't have a paragraph structure without words. So in our brain, and we forget this often, and it's only brought out when careful study is made of people with certain injuries, then we see the abstraction process. We see that some words are unformable, some vowels are unpronounceable with certain localized injuries in the brain. And so we see the edge of this abstraction process very clearly. Well, in addition to the concept of image or resonant representation being a very useful way, we also can see, which is characteristic but not absolute, okay? The first brain, the sensory motor brain, its primary focus is on staying alive now. So we could say, in a sense temporally, that the first brain has a very dominant qualification around the present moment. It doesn't have, in terms of learning, it doesn't have much of a memory. It has some memory. Lizards can learn their space, and they learn to manipulate and wander through that space. They learn to plan, actually, to plan ambushes to get food and so forth. So it's not an ignorant brain. It is very intelligent within its own arena, but its dominance is in what I choose to call the the instinctive triad, the triad of staying alive today, getting food, and then reproducing into the future. And that's where it's, all of that is essentially now, and the future is totally automatized. In other words, reproduction at this level in one-brain creatures is something that is cyclic. It is totally biochemically determined, influences of the outside world and so forth, conditioning when it's going to take place and so forth. So its future is not a future in the sense that it can be abstracted or seen into. With the coming of mammalian life forms and the growth of the limbic brain, the second brain, now we see a tail, okay? Perhaps metaphorically, more than metaphor, for the tails that appear in the mammalian species, because they develop a very, very long memory. There are all kinds of delightful stories about elephants never forgetting and so on and so on. But what this emphasizes is the role that memory plays into the past, and how essential and important that is in what the limbic brain is concerned with, which is essentially the images that have to do with self and other within the family unit, MacLean's family triad and so forth. All the elaborations of that require and are greatly enhanced by memory. In a sense, it also is a trap, because it means that responses to the present moment leaning toward the future are going to be qualified or conditioned almost totally by the past, how it has happened before, what they've done. So new experiences, frighteningly new experiences that we can point to by the thousands in our world of modern man entering with weapons of destruction and so forth and so on into the world of mammalian species, just produces pandemonium because they have no history with it. However, they do learn. In other words, they have memory of these frightening experiences if you carry that into their near future, and then their response is often fear or flight, or aggression, and nothing in between. But that is not the life of the second brain. The second brain is the heart of nurture and the family and of relationship and so forth. So we have to step back and see that in its natural environment to really understand what role time plays in the mammalian or limbic creatures. With us, because of the abstracting potential of the third brain, we project into the future with the neocortex in a way in which mammalian life and dinosaurs cannot. And this again is a real double-edged sword. We can construct images, concepts of a future that we wish for, but then it depends on what we wish for, and then we have this highest form of abstraction at our immediate use. So we can use all the powers of abstraction plus seeing into the emotional nature, seeing the past, and then applying that to the physical world, to the world of objects and forms. So we become a formidable force because of that ability largely to see into the future, to forecast into it. So that has to be matched with image. It's useful to summarize the enormous powers and the direction of those powers with respect to each of the brains as we've described them. In the reptilian world, the present moment and survival is paired to the development of the sensory and motor systems. And we see this remarkable modification through evolution of trial and error. And very often we forget how many times it's been an error. We look back and we identify certain creatures, but we also have to keep in mind, to make it real, that there were many, many other experiments that didn't work out. So the whole of the evolutionary thrust is we can point to what its aim is in terms of survival in the moment and with food and with reproductive activity. But still in all, we have to see the limits of that it is the present moment that has really restricted the attention. When we come to the mammalian brain, the limbic brain, this enormous tale of a past appears. And this increases the versatility, but it also increases the world of relationship enormously within the family, the grouping, the tribe, etc. And we see this reflected in our three-brained cultural history, in the dominance right up to the present day. Ethnicity is based on the recognition that men are the progenitors. So when that appears in life, and there is some argument as to exactly when did the male recognize that the offspring were somehow his. That paternity, that concept of paternity, whether it was unconscious or conscious is really not important. It did finally appear. And when it did, it becomes the substrate of this family, this grouping, this clan, this ethnicity, this race. And this is still a major, major factor in today's world. However unconscious most of it happens to be, because we see these divisions in image, even into the present day, where we think that one group or one ethnic group is less than another, or this should be done to them or for them or whatever, when all of the while we're all one group, we're all one species, and that's been one of our biggest struggles over time, has been to sort out the end result of what is essentially something that happened in mammalian life during the evolutionary development of mammalian life forms. So the overview there is one that opens into the past and opens the production of images of a different quality, a different type, what we call feelings. And this is a whole world. With the emergence of the neocortex, and this doesn't happen de novo either. This has a long, long evolutionary history that I think recent researchers are beginning to show more and more clearly, that the abstracting capacities that man has for so long claimed were only his are really not only his. We see abstracting capacities, sometimes a rather surprising development occurring in the high primates, and even earlier, when such things as counting and simple arithmetic, that the concept, the ability to abstract that, is obviously present. We also see some very, very sophisticated levels of communication with dolphins and whales. We're beginning to see now some enormously complex things that we never knew existed, and yet they betray a very, very high development of abstracting capacity. So when the neocortical brain reaches its development in man, I won't say final development, because who knows about the future, but in any case, we end up with an instrument that now potentially has power over the other two brains. Not always, but it can have power over the other two brains, because it's almost like we have an outer world and an inner world, and then we have an abstract world, which in a sense can look down on the products of these other two views into the outer and inner world, and can come to concepts about the nature of this outer and inner world, but can also create its own concepts. And this is a marvel. This is just a great mystery how this could possibly take place. But in any event, the most important part of that for me is that it is an immense power. And a large part of that power is that it is tied to the future. It has this arrow into the past. It has an arrow into the present moment. So it can stay alive, but it also can enter into relationships. It can enter into the whole of limbic life, and then it can also have this enormous, infinite world of abstraction that allows it to look on both of these worlds and also create worlds that never were and never can be. It's hard in the world of cold-blooded creatures or early vertebrate life forms. It's hard to see a self in the neural sense emerging, because it's essentially a one-dimensional world, if you will. It doesn't have the inner dimension of a developed limbic system, and it has very, very limited abstracting capacity. So whatever its sense of self is, we certainly can't put ourselves in that position. So it's kind of imagination on our part to try and get back in there, but it certainly would have to be immensely diminished. Diminished, for instance, compared to what we see emerge in mammalian life, when with the limbic system in place in the past, growing and developing and becoming more and more influential relative to the present, clearly a sense of self, and I say a sense of self, not a self, but a sense of self, emerges as the end result of the neural processing. We see this in our pets. We recognize the clear personality differences between, and so they have a clear sense of themselves as a creature. How individuated that is, that again is very debatable. When we get to the third brain, only man says I, and I think there's obviously something of really profound significance there. And most of the time, it's rare for a child to say I until about the age of 3.5 or 4 years old. I can remember my children, all of them referred to themselves. They said, Cheryl wants this, or whatever. They would speak of themselves as if there was something outside that was, but they didn't use the word I, in spite of the fact that the parents and everybody else, all of the other adults, are using I all of the time. So there's this interesting question. Why, what is it that the child doesn't have relative to its sense that leads it not to use that term at all? That's why I call this I that emerges, that we speak from, as a sense of I. It is not I in any individuated sense beyond that, or at least I wouldn't think that appropriate in looking at it this way. But clearly there is a sense of I, and that's again the result of neural processes that involve all three brains. We are three-dimensional in that sense for ourselves. And that uniqueness that places us in this three-dimensional world, we identify as I. We name ourselves, and there is a uniqueness in the naming. We are separated off from all other creatures, etc., etc. And that's what I mean by the sense of I. There are many cultures where they don't use I very much, especially in Aboriginal cultures. But there is a sense of I in the sense of recognizing that they are a unique individual, perhaps very closely tied to the group, and perhaps all of their behavioral characteristics very, very much modified by their inclusion within the group. We see this in Indian populations, even in the United States today, where there isn't any clear sense of separation of that I from the group, but there is still a sense of I. Major determining factor here for me is the life history of the individual at whatever point we stop at the age of 12 or 20 or 30 or whatever. Because here the influence of the limbic brain, the past, I think becomes very, very dominant, and increasingly so, because it is increasingly restrictive. The boundaries, the self-image, the images that we have of ourselves, is almost, in most family circumstances, is almost completely prescribed by everything that happens from the moment of conception on, including intrauterine life and intrauterine development. We know now that there are many influences that can be very profound throughout the life of the individual that happened before they were born. So that's the kind of thing that I mean. In addition, there is just the DNA itself. and the fact that certain capacities or lack of capacities is often preset long before we're born. But then we begin our life experience within the family, with parents and so on and so on. And you know, the brain is a hunting instrument. All three brains hunt for significance in the realm that they are open to. So the first brain is open to the outside world and the interface with the outside world, and that's where it hunts for significance. And the same thing is true of the inner senses that begin to develop with the second brain. They're hunting for significance. And then in the third brain, we hunt for significance, looking around the world. What does this mean? How does this happen? Et cetera, et cetera. So this hunting is built in. There is no way to defy it, at least as an urge. Unfortunately, much of parenting is a progressive restriction. Don't do this. Do this only this way. This is how you learn. Blah blah blah. And this just goes on. If anything, layer upon layer upon layer, because as the child grows, we can say that, say for the first year or so, all of the attention is really in maturing the first brain sufficient so that the child can walk independently. And then it moves into the terrible twos, which is the first cycle into the emotional world of the child beginning to develop. So at each of these stages, and then finally the child begins to talk, and we see the intellectual unfolding beginning around the age of 4 generally. But then we go through these cycles throughout the whole of our life. So at each of these, depending on the events, depending on what the background has been, depending on the life experiences that are allowed, permitted, encouraged, and so forth, all of those bring about this constriction that you were referring to. They say that you can be this, but you will never be this, etc., and on and on and on. And yet when we look at the capacities that are there in the three brains of a human being, we see this immense potential. Mothers know this. Mothers clearly recognize. They know that their son could be president of the United States. I mean, they know that. It's not a hope or anything, because it happens. And so it's there in the potency of that possibility. So those are unfortunately, in most instances, greatly limited by this upbringing, by what surrounds the child in these early years. And the earlier years are the most important, because nothing grows as fast as the brain does in the first year. It never grows so fast again. It never forms so many connections again. So its learning capacity, and this again is one of the marvelous things we're beginning to really look into and see very clearly, that the learning capacity in the early years is astonishing. That a child can learn 6 languages simultaneously, and the 20-year-old struggles to get a second language. Same thing with physical skills. At the level of 6, 7, 8-year-olds, you see this accumulation of increasingly fine coordinated skills that just defy logic when you're 25 years old trying to learn the same kind of thing. So we have to be appreciative of the unfolding and the speed with which this is unfolding in each of the three brains, or each of these 3 aspects of our one brain. But we have to see the terrible vulnerabilities that are built into it as well. That if it is restricted by the past, if the patterns are repeated and only certain kinds of openings are allowed, then the whole world of abstraction collapses. It grows to a certain point, and then it is cut off by surrounding life. Science has had enormous impact on how we see ourselves. Unfortunately, or lawfully, this turns in an almost infinite number of directions. It can be, and has been in the line of some people's lives, the most demeaning force that has ever happened in the line of their life. On the other, it has been the most freeing, and then everything in between. Science enlarges our view of the world immensely in all directions, looking outward into the size of the cosmos and so on and so on, but looking inward in so many ways into our cellular nature, molecular nature, and so forth and so on. So it certainly has expanded our realization of how immense, how complex the world is, and this has been, you could say, this is a major accomplishment of science, is that it has given us these increasingly wide and penetrating views, not only of what is there, but also the processes that are involved in that. And one of the things that we were exploring yesterday that I think is so vitally important now is that with all that science has brought, it's absolutely essential to see that it has not brought us freedom. That's not its job, in a sense. That's not its role. Its role is to look at the world and say, what's there and why is it happening and how is it happening and so forth. Not what role does it play in the destiny of mankind or of all life or anything. Those are other orders of question that science has, really from the origin, has said this is not our province. Not that there is no such province. This is, again, something that I think people lay at the door of science that doesn't belong there. You would not ask a spiritually minded person to give a lecture on quantum mechanics. So you can't lay that at the door of the spiritual teacher that he doesn't know anything about quantum mechanics. That's not his job. And it's not the job of science in that sense to do other than look at, be curious about, and then find out as much as he can about the way things work and what they are, what their nature is insofar as they can describe it. The problems enter immensely as soon as you get outside of the specific clear arena of what science is focused on. Because scientists are also fathers and sons and mothers and so forth. They have lives in their limbic brain of relationship and so forth. And it is inevitable that all that science has come up with, has discovered, would impact these other arenas. In the most negative sense, we could see this in the atomic bomb, we can see it in new armaments, we can see it in jet planes, we can see it in all kinds of negative ways that bring terrible destructive power, not because of science and what science saw, but because of how it's made use of. And it's other parts of us that make use of it. The Neanderthal part now we know is they really were a separate species. So they were not our predecessors. But the important thing that you note is, knowledge by itself, I would say especially when it accumulates in the way in which it has accumulated in Western science, becomes an unbalancing influence, an unbalancing force into the life of man, into all life, that is so unbalancing as to end up being just incredibly destructive. Knowledge is not understanding. Understanding requires all three brains, the capacities of all three brains, in right relationship, as well as purpose, as well as intent, as well as seeing the future, as well as being bounded by the past and the limitations of the past. And then, is it practical? Is it possible? And so all three of our parts have to be in proper balance. And what unfortunately, one of the byproducts of scientific investigation, especially in the last, say, 100, 150 years, has been a great unbalancing of that. The middle world, the limbic world, has been almost not just left out, it has been assaulted. I mean, a frontal assault. When you look at Charles Dickens and you look at the effluent that he describes coming out of the Industrial Revolution, that's I think one of the most traumatic characterizations. Other people have done it in more modern times, but he goes back here at the origin. This starts 1800 or even shortly before that, when suddenly the power of the technological application of scientific insights begins to invade. And then that invasion doesn't have anything to do with the world of abstraction. It has to do with using that, applying that in the political, religious, philosophical, whatever sense to the circumstances that we live in, without any understanding of its consequences in those worlds. And that has been a terror, the most precarious circumstance that is, I believe, has ever happened in the life of mankind. We really are at the brink. We have the capacity to really permanently do away with ourselves. Well, we can look at that in two ways. One is the unrealistic, which is to say, what if it happened differently 200 years ago? Okay, we can look at it that way and say, how could it have worked its way out differently, which it didn't? Or we can put the question in terms of today and say, okay, given the mess that we're in, now if we were to make the effort to bring the limbic brain back as a more balancing mechanism inside of us, how would we do that, and how would that work out? In the first instance, I think we can give examples that if there had been more awareness of the essentiality, the absolute essentiality, for instance, of the family triad, of the family as the center point of nurture and early development and so forth and so on, then we would not have seen the sweatshops that came out of the steam engine, okay? The development of these enormous factories that brought people out of circumstances in which they had competence and had a place and were playing a role in their community, into a factory situation where they were simply a widget, a total denial of their humanness, of their role as a father, as a mother, as a child, or whatever. These are all denials. This is what I mean by the assault. And the assault, while it's certainly other cultures have assaulted this brain, this assault has been the most penetrating and has produced the greatest changes in the cultural set itself. So we can go back and look at the origin of those things. Then we can also look at the origin of each new technology and see how it did not do what many people intended it to do when the innovation was made. Television. I think television is a perfect example of society not understanding what does this instrument do to us, how we are now a passive instrument sitting in front of this, and we take it as real because our brain says it's real. And so we cloud and just flood the mind with all of these images that are resonant with the images that our own brain forms, only they're preformed, they're already prefabricated, and they're put inside of us. What a social instrument that has been. And very largely because of the world of propaganda and money making and so on and so on, it has turned into a terrible negative, incredibly negative force, which by and large most of society, including the Academy of Pediatrics, doesn't recognize. The difficulty is that life has become so complex and so demanding and we are so suggestible. I think suggestibility is maybe the biggest single vulnerability that we have. And because I talk with so many people back in the days when Mandy and I were traveling around giving these talks on television to public groups and to teaching, to educational groups and so forth and so on. We had people come up afterwards, parents come up afterwards, some of them in tears, and say, I want to do this, but I haven't been able to. They are so trapped in their suggestibility and influenced by this that they cannot not watch. And it was a real eye opener when these people came up of having goodwill. In a sense, they are empathic to their children. You see, they want to do the right thing by their children and so forth. They don't want this kind of influence, but they can't do it. And I said, wow, this is a big deal. How can you really change anything if there is that degree of paralysis of the will? There are a number of approaches that have been taken, because this imbalance has been recognized by a lot of good people over the last 100 years in particular. So there have been a lot of efforts, a lot of trials, a lot of starts here and there. I think one of the most interesting ones is a kind of an offshoot of the Gurdjieff work in Bennett's work about relative to communities. He felt that it was absolutely essential to have communities that would provide appropriate parenting. In other words, would place into the child exactly this empathic enablement, okay? And it would start from a very, very young age. But he recognized clearly that you had to start with the parents. That was his notion of community life. We have to form new communities that do this. I think Waldorf has done very much the same. The Steiner communities and the Waldorf schools themselves have done yeoman's work in this direction. They're not as total a community, except in certain isolated areas. Most Waldorf schools draw into the general community, and they do the best they can to convince parents to limit this and do this and do this, and that has its influence. But if you talk to many Waldorf teachers, you find that they're frustrated too, because it obviously bumps into this resistance that comes. So that effort to form new communities, to be models, seems to be one of the conclusions that some very wise people have come to, and say this is the only way this is going to happen. We have to form communities that will then model this behavior and activity, and this will be so positive that it will have its gradual influence out into the world. Individual efforts have really not come to very much, except if you read Ode or you read some of the magazines that really highlight efforts that are being made in 150 different countries throughout the world. And some of them are starting from very small things. The microeconomics that has entered in a number of countries, where the effort is to make people more self-sufficient, to support the family, to give them the tools that they can maintain their family life and not have to go to the cities and so forth. Unfortunately, there are those economic forces that are right now enormously powerful. Look at China, look at India, look at the United States in our economic difficulties. What is the arena of choices that individuals, even individuals of very good intentions with regard to their family and so forth, what options do they have? This is a tight box that they've been put in. So how this can work out, I guess I would favor the communities. I think that we have got to do everything we can to make this as open a community. That some of the communities that come about, they get based on a specific religious or spiritual pursuit, they end up creating walls, and they're not really open into the community. And this is always a tough issue. How do you open the doors and yet not get swamped, by all that's out there invading this communal atmosphere that you're trying to establish. That's a difficult issue. But I don't see any other way other than through modeling. But certainly the soul has been an issue, and in some instances throughout history, a very, very big issue, and in others, not so much a big issue. But in any case, every religion and every philosophical system that has come into being on the planet Earth has, in one way or another, had to address this issue because they are natural questions. What happens? Am I more than just my physical body? What happens when I die? Et cetera, et cetera. And all of the elaborations of that have been approached by all of these different disciplines in a panorama of approaches. For me, the most practical way the most realistic way to begin in this direction is to say that in my own subjective experience, I recognize that there are things that are not physical, mass-based. They are not part of my body. They are not my bones and my muscles. When I have thoughts and feelings, those are not in the physical world. In fact, modern science is having great difficulty. They pontificate a lot, but they still come down, when you really put them in a corner, they still don't know. The nature of image, that I talk a lot about, but the nature of the image in the brain, not known, conjectural. Maybe in 100 years we'll come across more evidence of a specific level that we can relate more directly to image. So we were talking about the soul, or the question of the soul came up in this context, and certainly this has been approached from many different directions over long periods of time by every tradition and philosophy that has ever taken place on the planet. For me, the most practical way to begin to look at it, because I think it's an enormously large question, and the one thing that is most unsatisfactory is to take any of those answers that have been offered from the past that is simplistic, that says this is the way it is, blah, 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 blah. And then you've got this box that you either buy or you don't buy. That doesn't help us, I think, because the problem is too important. It is too large. It is too subtle to be dismissed with pronouncements that come from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. That's not to say whether they are right or not. That's not my point. My point is that today, when the question of the soul relative to the self, when that comes up, I think we have to take all of the resources that are available to us, including all of the resources that science makes available, and put it to the test. This is something I think that the Dalai Lama has been a real leader in saying, okay, we have to use the best of this technology to try to get as much as we can of a measurement of what it is that's going on inside of the brain. Because it's clearly not material. It's clearly not mass-based. And that puts it into another world where we have all manner of questions that we can ask, and we can only try to accumulate evidence of something that would have to do with a soul. My own persuasion, which comes very largely, obviously, from Goethe, is he would say flat out to begin with, no, we do not have a soul. We are not born with a soul. But there is the possibility that with sufficient and intense work, one may make a soul, create a soul. That's a very different point of view, and in a sense, seems more pragmatic to me. It seems more practical, more real. Otherwise, I have to accept that I was born with a soul. I don't know what to do with that. Not any longer. I mean, it's like, okay, fine. Is this soul perfectible? Can it improve? Is it? Do I have to do something to make sure that it stays pure? And all of these kinds of questions come up. Whereas if I am going to make a soul or create a soul, then there are a totally different arena of questions that come up that say, in effect, from the very outset, I don't understand this world. I don't know anybody who does. So we have to begin with what we can begin with. I can begin, for instance, by saying, I know my thoughts and my feelings and my sensations come and go. They are not permanent. They are not eternal. Well, they only produce images anyhow. Could that be the soul? Well, but that would mean that the soul is an image that comes and goes, and it's created. And so, knowing what we know about neurophysiology, we can begin to at least construct reasonable questions. And we can say, well, on the basis of what we know, it can't be this. It can't be an image. If it's real, if it really reflects something of the real world, then it has to be beyond image. Okay. how do I approach that question, you see? And this brings us then to this question that we've been trying to consider the last several days, the question of attention. And what is it, or what are its qualities and attributes? And then we can go to the literature and see what other people have said about attention. And we can begin to learn something about the uniqueness and the shared qualities of attention and the powers of attention that are beyond image. And maybe I discover that it seems that attention is the most creative or procreative power that I can come up with. Nothing else can match it in its creativity. So if I am going to create a soul, maybe this has a great deal to do with my attention and its powers and attributes, and then how I make use of that. And that raises the question of, can I make use of it? This attention, I see in my daily life that my attention flits all over the place. It's pulled here and it's pulled there, and then it's occupied with this, and then associatively it easily gets bumped off and heads off in all these different directions. So if it is this very, very powerful force or whatever, it's also very subject to all kinds of things that can influence where it's going to go. So what is to direct it? What is to point it and use it relative to the creation of a soul, if such things exist? So this then raises the question of what is behind the attention. If the attention is a power, and it is a procreative power, fine. But how do I know how to procreate with it? You know, it's kind of like, how is it controlled? How is it directed? And this raises these interesting questions, again, that have been addressed by the traditions in so many different interesting ways. And that has to do essentially with the will. How do we understand the will? What do we understand by the will? Because if we are going to create something, and we've come to the conclusion that in order to truly create something, that we have to be able to empower the attention, because that's the only instrument that will do this, then we are really left with this fundamental question of what is my will? What is the will? And now the question that we began with, I am not who I think I am, becomes a question of what is my will? What is my attention? And these, in the subjective world of self-examination, are much more interesting questions than all of the external manifestations in print that are out there that tell me what the soul is and where it came from and so forth and so on. Because for the most part, I cannot validate any of those. I cannot test any of those. I cannot say, well, maybe it's true and maybe it's not. But if in our modern time, because of modern communications and modern printing and modern sharing and all that is out there, I don't have one perspective in the line of my life. I have not been raised as a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew in a given cultural setting. I got 1,000 cultural settings around me. We all do. So who are you going to buy? What are you going to buy? And I think this attitude, or this question, what are we going to buy into? What is a very, very important one. If I see so clearly around this question of the soul that my Jewish background or my Christian background says this or that, well, if I see that none of that is really me. After all, when I was born, my parents modeled that for me. They put all of that into me. The priest did, or the rabbi, or whatever. I didn't put it there. So at the age of 5 or 6, when I ask Mom and Dad, who are we? Or well, you're a Jew, or you're a Christian, or you're a Baptist, or you're a this or that. And the question which does come up at that age in many of us, how the hell did I get to be that? What does that mean to be a Baptist or a Christian? well, that's our culture, that's our lineage, and so forth and so on. Yeah, but what does that mean? You know, why should lineage, being born of this and this and this and this, make me this? That doesn't seem to add up. And many people have raised those questions, but if you're totally immersed in that and there is nothing else, then you're not going to find your way out of that very easily. But in today's world, it ain't like that. We are surrounded by these differing points of view, and we have to pose the issue. Either that or retreat. Not inquire at all and say, well, this is what I am, damn it, and this is what I'm going to stay. And then we stand in our world of conviction, and nothing happens. Then the question of the soul is already answered. Whatever the tradition says it is, that's what it is. And so your question has no meaning to me, because I already know what it is. So it comes down, for me, it comes down to this interesting question that is that I cannot follow any path that is out there that has been scored out in granite from the past. If I do that, then I am simply a slave to whatever that is that has been put forward. It is not mine. What can be mine can only be through my own effort. And if I begin to inquire into that, I come up with, again, as I said, I come up with the question of creating something and then seeing that it is only the power of attention that is free enough to be able to create something from myself. Because everything else I can't create with. I can't do anything in the molecular world. Put a bunch of molecules in front of me and I can wish all I want, and there's not a darn thing that's going to happen in that world. I'm not going to make plastic. I'm not going to make radios or TVs or jet planes. I can't create or make any of those. What is the instrument of creation that I do have some power over that is not bounded by the material world? Because the question of the soul is one essentially of what is beyond the material world and so forth. So from my perspective, and it's not just my perspective, but it's one I've been helped immensely toward, is that that has to require controlling or determining or willing the attention. Well, the question there, the way you ask the question, you say we, and it raises the question of who am I? And what is the I? When you're talking about this, did we exist before we were born? Did we exist as an entity, as a three-brained creature in some other state or whatever? Again, trying to be as pragmatic, as practical as we can. We can't say very much about the physical world having any application to that state. Before we were conceived, we start saying, well, we start from the adult status, okay, with my 3 trillion cells or so, and I kind of make that smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and I get down to a multi-celled embryo and at a mulberry stage of 30 or 32 cells, and then I'm all the way down to 1 cell, and then I'm down to a sperm and an egg, and then where do I go from there? Well, clearly I'm leaving the world of the cellular molecular. At least I've been getting at the lower limits. So however we can ask the question of where were we or were we before we were born, it cannot be in the context of a physical something or other. Is it something that could have memory? Well, again, we each kind of have to explore this for ourselves. How could I have memory if I have no brains? If I don't have a limbic system that grew this tail, could I remember something? And my conclusion is no. I don't see any. There's not a requirement for me to pose that there are attributes from previous lives that become embodied in this disembodied state that somehow or other are there, the best that they could possibly be would be as image. They would not be. They could participate in this world of the non-material, but they would have to be images in order to be memories, in order to have prior existence or whatever. So for myself, I can't go there because I can't make sense out of it.